Veltar stood in the center of the great crystal chamber, his pale blue hands shaking as he watched the latest reports flow through the collective mind of his people. The images were always the same. Worlds turning black, stars going dark, entire systems vanishing as if they had never existed at all. The Devourers had come to the edge of Zenari space dot around him. The other members of the High Council sat in perfect circles, their thoughts flowing together like streams meeting a river. For 3,000 years, the Zenari had lived this way. No secrets, no lies, no violence. Their minds touched each other constantly, sharing every thought and feeling. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was also making them helpless against the thing that was coming to destroy them. "Show me again," Veltar whispered, though his words were not needed. In the collective mind, all thoughts were shared the moment they formed. The holographic display in the center of the chamber flickered to life. It showed the Kelvin system, home to 2 billion gentle plant-like beings who had spent their entire existence growing gardens and composing music from the sound of wind through their leaves. The display showed their world as it had been 3 days ago, green and blue and a live dot. Then it showed what the system looked like now. Nothing. Empty space where a star and 6 planets had once been. Not destroyed. Not broken apart. Simply gone, as if something had eaten the very atoms that made them. "The Devourers consume everything," said Council Leader Mortian, her ancient voice carrying the weight of centuries. "They do not kill. They absorb. They take worlds, stars, even the space around them, and make it part of themselves." Veltar closed his eyes and felt the fear of his people washing through the collective mind like a cold tide. In all their thousands of years of peace, they had never faced anything like this. They had no weapons. They had no armies. They did not even understand the concept of fighting. "The refugees from the outer systems bring the same reports," continued Mortian. "The Devourers send out scouts first. Small creatures that look like floating jellyfish made of metal. These scouts study each world, each species. Then the main force comes. What is the main force?" asked young council member SciFi, though they all knew he already knew the answer from the collective mind. "A single ship. Always just one. But it is alive, and it is larger than our moons. When it arrives at a world, it does not attack. It simply opens itself and begins to sing." The word "sing" made every Zenari in the chamber shiver. They had all felt the recordings that the refugees carried in their minds. The song of the Devourers was not music. It was something that reached into the mind and pulled. It called to every living thing, promising unity and peace and an end to the loneliness of individual thought. And every species that had heard the song had walked willingly into the ship. "The tall Murray went first," Mortian continued, sharing memories that made the council weep. 6 billion beings of pure thought, living in crystal cities that floated among their gas giant. They heard the song and left their cities behind. They flew into the Devourer ship, and the ship consumed their world. Then the hive worlds of the sectoids, trillions of insect beings who had lived in perfect harmony for eons. The song came, and they marched in perfect lines into the ship. Their queen was the last to go. She sent out a message before she entered the ship. She said the song promised her that her children would never feel fear again. Veltar felt sick. The Zenari understood fear now, though they had never known it before. It was a cold, sharp thing that sat in the stomach and made thinking clearly impossible. What did the survivors tell us? He asked, though he knew this too was already shared among them. That those who are taken are not killed, Mortian said softly. They become part of the Devourers. Their minds join the collective consciousness of the ship. They become something new, something united. But they are no longer themselves. So the Devourers grow stronger with each world they take, said SciFi. Yes, and they are coming here. The scouts have been seen in our outer systems. We have perhaps 6 months before the ship arrives. The chamber fell silent. In the collective mind, Veltar could feel the thoughts of millions of his people. Parents holding their children closer. Artists trying to finish their life's work. Scientists searching desperately for some solution, some way to fight or flee. But the Zanari had never learned to fight. And there was nowhere to run. The Devourers had consumed everything around them. We must send out the call, Veltar said finally. The other council members turned to look at him with their large, silver eyes. The call for what? Asked Mortian. For help. There must be other species out there. Older ones. Wiser ones. Beings who have learned to stop things like the Devourers. What kind of help could we ask for? What kind of beings could face something that has consumed 1,000 worlds? Veltar was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of his entire species in his mind. Then he spoke, his words flowing out into the collective consciousness of every Zanari alive. Celestial saviors, he said. Beings of pure light and wisdom. Ancient ones who understand the deeper mysteries of the universe. Entities who have transcended violence and learned to heal rather than harm. And what would we ask these saviors to do? To teach us the path to salvation through peace. To show us how to touch the minds of the Devourers and heal their broken souls. To guide us to a solution that saves both our people and theirs. The council was silent, but Veltar could feel their agreement flowing through the collective mind. It was their only hope. Within hours, the great transmitters of the Zanari homeworld began broadcasting their message to the stars. It was a plea filled with beauty and hope, asking for beings of wisdom and light to come and save them through peace and understanding. The message spoke of their desperate need for celestial saviors who could show them the path to salvation without violence or hatred. As the transmission spread out among the stars, Veltar stood in the crystal chamber and prayed to the ancient forces of harmony that someone would hear their call. Someone did hear, but the beings who responded to their plea for celestial saviors would prove to be something the peaceful Zanari had never imagined in their worst nightmares. The first sign that their prayer had been answered came 3 months after the transmission ended. A Zanari deep space monitor, a gentle being named Hilan, who spent his days listening to the music of distant stars, detected something approaching their system. Ships, he reported to the collective mind, his thoughts tinged with hope. Many ships, moving faster than anything we have ever seen. Veltar felt the excitement ripple through the minds of his people. Veltar felt the excitement ripple through the minds of his people. The saviors had come, the beings of light and wisdom who would show them the path to peace. But as the ships grew closer and the Zanari sensors got a better look at them, the excitement began to turn to confusion, then unease, then something approaching fear. These ships, whispered Hilan, his mental voice shaking. They are not what I expected. The vessels that emerged from hyperspace were nothing like the crystal ships of the Zanari or the elegant curves of other peaceful species they had encountered. These ships were dark gray and black, covered in angles that seemed designed to hurt the eye. They bristled with things that could only be weapons. Massive guns and missile pods that served no purpose except to destroy. But it was the names painted on the hulls that made the Zanari recoil in horror. Inevitable consequence. Read one massive battleship. Necessary evil, proclaimed another. The flagship, larger than any vessel the Zanari had ever imagined, bore the name Final Solution in letters that seemed to burn with dark fire. What kind of saviors named their ships such things? Asked Council Leader Mortian, her thoughts heavy with dread. They soon found out. A communication came from the flagship. and the voice that spoke was unlike anything in Zanari experience. It was hard and sharp, with none of the flowing harmony that marked all peaceful species. It belonged to something that called itself Admiral Sarah Chun, and it requested permission to meet with the Zanari leadership. Veltar wanted to refuse. Every instinct in his peaceful mind screamed that these beings were dangerous. But the Devourers were still coming, and these dark ships were the only response to their plea. The meeting was arranged on the surface of the Zanari homeworld, in the great garden of first thought where their civilization had begun. The Zanari hoped that the beauty and peace of the place might show their visitors the proper path. Admiral Chun arrived with an escort of 6 other beings. The Zanari had expected tall, glowing figures radiating wisdom and light. Instead, they saw creatures that looked like walking nightmares. The humans were shorter than Zanari, but they moved with a predator's grace that made every peaceful bone in Zanari bodies ache with wrongness. Their eyes were small and hard, constantly moving and watching. Their faces showed expressions that the Zanari had no names for, things like determination and controlled, aggression and the willingness to do terrible things, but it was what the humans carried with them that made several council members faint. Outright weapons, not tools that could be used as weapons, but objects designed for no purpose except to kill. Guns that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Knives with edges so sharp they seemed to cut the light around them. Explosives that could level city blocks. "You sent a call asking for saviors," said Admiral Chun, her voice cutting through the harmony of the garden like a blade. "We're here to save you." Veltar tried to speak, but found that his voice had abandoned him. In the collective mind of his people, he could feel waves of terror and revulsion washing back and forth. The humans were everything the Zanari were not. Where the Zanari sought peace, these beings radiated controlled violence. Where the Zanari shared all thoughts, these creatures kept their minds locked away behind barriers of steel. "You are not what we expected," Veltar finally managed to say. "No," agreed Admiral Chun with something that might have been amusement. "We get that a lot. You asked for celestial saviors. You got humanity. We're probably not what your people had in mind, but we're what answered your call. We asked for beings of wisdom and light," said Council Leader Mortian, her voice shaking. "Entities who could guide us to salvation through peace." Admiral Chun looked around the garden, taking in the crystal spires and floating meditation platforms and streams that sang as they flowed. "This is very pretty," she said. "Very peaceful. The Devourers will love it." "What do you mean?" "I mean that everything about your civilization makes you perfect prey for the Devourers. You're unified, predictable, peaceful. You've never learned to fight or hide or lie. When the Devourer ship arrives, your people will hear its song and walk right into its mouth, just like every other species it has consumed." The words hit the Zanari like physical blows. In the collective mind, Veltar could feel his people recoiling from the brutal truth of what they were hearing. "But you said you came to save us," he whispered. "I did. We will. But salvation isn't going to look like anything you've imagined." Admiral Chun gestured to her escort, and they began unpacking equipment that hurt to look at. Instruments of war and analysis that belonged in no peaceful place. "We're going to teach your people to survive. And survival means learning to be something other than prey. What do you want us to become?" Admiral Chun smiled, and it was the most frightening expression Veltar had ever seen. "Monsters," she said simply. "Like us." The Zanari Council erupted in horror. In the collective mind, millions of voices cried out in revulsion and fear. Several council members collapsed, overwhelmed by the psychic shock of what they had heard. "You cannot ask us to abandon everything we are," said Mortian, tears flowing down her face. "We are beings of peace and harmony. We have spent thousands of years building a civilization based on love and understanding. And in 6 weeks, the Devourers will arrive and turn all of that into nothing," Admiral Chun replied. "Your choice is simple. Learn to fight or learn to be food. We would rather die as we are than live as monsters." "No," said Admiral Chun, her voice suddenly gentle. "You wouldn't. When the time comes, when you see your children walking toward the Devourer ship with empty smiles on their faces, you'll do anything to save them, even if it means becoming something you hate." She looked around the garden again, and for a moment, Valtar thought he saw something like sadness in her hard eyes. "We didn't come here to destroy who you are," she said. "We came here to give you the tools to remain who you are. But those tools are ugly, and using them will change you. The question is whether you want to be changed or consumed." The silence that followed was broken only by the singing of the garden streams and the quiet sobbing of the Zanari Council dot in the distance. Invisible to Zanari sensors, human warships began taking defensive positions around the system, their crews preparing for a war unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The humans began their work the next day, and the Zanari quickly learned that their saviors did not ask for permission. Human ships moved throughout the system, setting up what they called research stations and tactical positions. When the Zanari Council protested that they had not agreed to any of this, Admiral Chun simply replied that the Devourers would not ask permission either. The first horror came when the humans captured one of the Devourer scouts. The creature had been drifting at the edge of the system for weeks, a thing like a jellyfish made of living metal that pulsed with its own dark light. The Zanari had been afraid to approach it, sensing the wrongness that radiated from its alien mind. The humans had no such fears. A human ship called Righteous Fury tracked down the scout and captured it using weapons that caused pain to everything they touched. They brought the creature to one of their research stations, and then they began to study it in ways that made every Zanari who learned of it sick. Dr. James Morrison, the chief human scientist, explained his methods to a horrified gathering of Zanari researchers. "We need to understand how the Devourer hive mind works," he said, his words cold and clinical. "The only way to do that is to take the scout apart piece by piece and see what makes it think." "But the creature is still alive," whispered Zenana, the Zanari's chief biologist. "It feels pain. It suffers." "Yes," agreed Dr. Morrison. "That's the point. Pain causes reactions. Fear causes changes in brain chemistry. If we want to understand how the Devourers process information, we need to see how they respond to stress." The Zanari could not comprehend this approach. In their collective mind, they felt the scout's agony like a knife cutting through their shared consciousness. But the humans continued their work, mapping every neural pathway and studying every response as they slowly dissected the living creature. "You are torturing it," said Zenana, her voice breaking. "We're learning from it," corrected Dr. Morrison, "and what we learn might save billions of lives." The information they gathered was terrible and wonderful at the same time. The Devourer scouts were not truly alive. They were extensions of a vast hive mind that stretched across light years. Every scout was connected to every other Devourer creature, sharing thoughts and experiences instantly. But the humans discovered something else, something that chilled even their hardened hearts. "The hive mind is not just connected," Dr. Morrison explained to Admiral Chun as they stood over the remains of the scout. "It's hungry, desperately hungry. The Devourers consume other species because they need to feed on consciousness itself. Without new minds to absorb, they start to die." "So they're not evil," said Admiral Chun. "They're desperate. Does it matter? A starving predator is still a predator." While the scientists worked, The human military began training Xenari civilians in what they called survival skills. The Xenari had a different name for it: the destruction of their souls. The training began with simple concepts that seemed harmless. Human instructors taught groups of young Xenari about individual thought, the idea that they could have private ideas that were not shared with the collective mind. At first, the young Xenari could not understand what the humans meant. How could a thought be private? How could the mind exist without connection to others? But slowly, with human guidance, some of them began to learn. They discovered how to build walls in their minds, creating small spaces where their thoughts could exist alone. The first time a young Xenari named Colin successfully hid a thought from his parents, he cried for 3 hours. "It feels like dying," he told his human instructor, a soldier named Sergeant Williams. "Like cutting off part of myself." "It feels like freedom," Sergeant Williams replied. "And freedom is what will keep you alive when the devourers come." The humans taught other things too. They showed the Xenari how to lie, how to speak words that were not true. They taught them about anger, about hatred, about the will to survive at any cost. They showed them weapons and explained how each one worked, what kind of damage it could do. Most horrible of all, they taught them about violence. The first time a Xenari struck another being in training, the shock nearly shattered the collective mind of their entire species. The young student, a gentle artist named Feloth, had been learning combat skills when something the humans called muscle memory took over. He hit his training partner with a force that would have been impossible for any Xenari before the humans arrived. "I felt his pain," Feloth sobbed afterward, his mind bleeding anguish into the collective consciousness. "I felt it, and I liked it. What am I becoming?" "You're becoming someone who can fight," said his instructor, Captain Lopez. "Someone who can protect the people you love." But the collective mind of the Xenari was fragmenting. As more and more of their people learned to think as individuals, the perfect harmony they had known for thousands of years began to break apart. Thoughts that had once flowed like music now clashed and competed. Ideas that had once been shared automatically now had to be spoken aloud. The older Xenari watched in horror as their children transformed into something unrecognizable. Young people who had once spent their days in meditation and artistic creation now practiced combat formations and weapon handling. They spoke in harsh, direct words instead of the flowing poetry that had marked Xenari communication for millennia. "They are becoming like the humans," said Council Leader Mortian, her thoughts heavy with grief. "Violent, separated, alone. They are becoming survivors," Admiral Chun replied when the Council confronted her. "And survival is what matters now. At what cost? We are losing our very souls." Admiral Chun looked at the ancient Xenari leader with something that might have been sympathy. "Your souls are beautiful," she said. "But beautiful souls don't stop the devourers. Ugly ones do." As if to prove her point, the human research teams made a breakthrough that changed everything. Dr. Morrison burst into the command center where Admiral Chun was planning the defense of the system. "We figured it out," he said, excitement and horror warring in his voice. "We know how the devourers work, and we know how to stop them. Tell me." The hive mind can only absorb consciousness that flows in predictable patterns. Every species they've consumed has been unified, harmonious, collective. The devourers sing to that unity and draw it into themselves. And chaos breaks the song. Individual will, contradiction, rebellion. These things are like poison to the hive mind. The devourers can't absorb what they can't understand, and they can't understand minds that think in patterns of beautiful madness. Admiral Chun smiled her terrible smile. "So we teach the Xenari to think like humans." "Exactly. We make them into the one thing the devourers cannot consume. Monsters. The most beautiful monsters in the galaxy. In the distance, Long-range sensors detected the approach of something vast and alien. The Devourer ship was coming, and it was larger than the humans had expected. But for the first time since arriving in the system, Admiral Chun felt something approaching hope. The Zanari were learning to be monsters. And monsters, she knew, were very hard to kill. Veltar had not slept in 3 days. Sleep was supposed to be easy for the Zanari. Their minds would simply join the collective unconsciousness and drift together through shared dreams. But the collective mind was fragmenting, breaking apart as more and more of his people learned to think as individuals. The young ones adapted quickly. Too quickly. Veltar watched his own daughter, Nessara, practicing combat forms with a human instructor and barely recognized her. The gentle artist who had once spent her days weaving light into poetry now moved with predatory grace. Her thoughts hidden behind walls that even her father could not breach. "She is lost to us," said Mortian, joining Veltar in the observation chamber overlooking the training grounds. They all are. Below them, dozens of young Zanari practiced with weapons and learned about tactics and strategy. Their minds, which had once shared everything, now buzzed with private thoughts and individual will. It was like watching the death of everything their species had been. "Perhaps," said Veltar quietly, "or perhaps we never understood what we were asking for when we sent out that call." "What do you mean?" Veltar was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter disarm her human instructor with a move that would have been unthinkable for any Zanari just months before. "I have been thinking about the word savior," he said finally. "We assumed it meant someone who would preserve what we are. But what if it means someone who transforms us into what we need to be?" Mortian shuddered. "You sound like one of them. Like the humans. Maybe that is not entirely a bad thing." Their conversation was interrupted by an alarm that rang through the facility. Long-range sensors had detected something approaching the edge of their system. Something vast. They gathered in the command center, humans and Zanari working side by side in a cooperation that would have been impossible months before. The main display showed the approaching object, and even the humans fell silent when they saw it. The Devourer ship was not a ship in any sense that made meaning. It was a living thing the size of a small moon, its surface covered in structures that pulsed and moved like organs. Tendrils of dark energy reached out from it, sampling the space around it, tasting the thoughts and dreams of the worlds ahead. "How long until it arrives?" asked Admiral Chun. 48 hours, replied Dr. Morrison, his face pale. "Maybe less. Are we ready?" "Ready as we'll ever be. The question is whether the Zanari are ready." All eyes turned to Veltar, and he felt the weight of his species' survival pressing down on him. In the broken fragments of the collective mind, he could feel his people's fear. But he could also feel something else. Something new. "Show me the plan," he said. Dr. Morrison activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room. "The Devourers consume by singing," he explained. "Their song reaches into the minds of their prey and calls to the part of consciousness that wants to belong, to be part of something larger. Every species they have encountered has answered that call. But not humans," said Veltar. It was not a question. No, not humans. Admiral Chun's voice carried an odd note of pride. "Humanity has always been fractured, divided, contradictory. We are a species that learned to survive by being unpredictable. The Devourer song calls to unity, but human consciousness is built on beautiful chaos. And now you have taught us to be chaotic as well." "Yes, but chaos alone will not be enough. The Devourers are not just predators. They are addicts, desperate for the consciousness they consume. When they discover that they cannot absorb your people, they will not simply leave. They will become desperate, dangerous. So what do? Dr. Morrison stepped forward. "We give them what they want, but we poison it first." The plan was elegant in its horror. The humans had spent weeks mapping the structure of the Devourer hive mind, learning how consciousness flowed through their collective awareness. They had discovered that the hive mind was like a vast network, with each individual devourer serving as a node that processed and shared information. What they don't understand, Dr. Morrison explained, is that consciousness is not just thoughts and memories. It includes contradictions, paradoxes, questions without answers. Human consciousness is full of these things. We are the only species that can believe two opposing ideas at the same time and not go insane. Most of the time, added Admiral Chun with dark humor. The Zanari who have learned to think as individuals now carry the same contradictions. Their minds contain both their original collective harmony and their new individual chaos. When the devourers try to consume this hybrid consciousness, they will absorb concepts that their hive mind cannot process. What kind of concepts? Asked Veltar. Doubt, rebellion, the idea that the individual can be more important than the collective. The concept of willing sacrifice for others who are not part of your group. Dr. Morrison's voice grew quiet. These ideas will spread through the hive mind like a virus, causing cascade failures throughout their network. You want us to allow ourselves to be absorbed? Some of you. Volunteers who understand the cost and are willing to pay it. The silence that followed was profound. In the fragmenting collective mind of the Zanari, Veltar felt his people processing this information. They would have to volunteer to be consumed by the enemy, knowing that their sacrifice might save their species, but would certainly destroy themselves as individuals. I will go first, said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Nessara. Veltar's daughter stepped forward. She looked like a Zanari, but she moved like a human, and her eyes held depths that her species had never known before. No, said Veltar, his voice breaking. I will not allow it. You taught me about individual choice, Father, Nessara replied, using words instead of thought-sharing for the first time in their relationship. This is my choice. Why? Nessara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her words carried wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. Because I understand now what the humans have given us. They did not teach us to be monsters to destroy our souls. They taught us to be monsters to save them. I do not understand. The humans are not monsters because they enjoy violence, Father. They are monsters because they are willing to become terrible things to protect what they love. They have shown us that sometimes salvation requires sacrifice. Sometimes peace requires war. Sometimes love requires the willingness to become what you hate. She looked around the room, her gaze taking in both the humans and her own people. We asked for celestial saviors, and we received them. But salvation is not gentle. It is not easy. It requires us to become something we never wanted to be. And what is that? Strong enough to survive. Ugly enough to win. Beautiful enough to remain worth saving. Admiral Chun stepped forward and placed a hand on Nessara's shoulder. You understand, she said simply. I understand that you came here not to destroy us, but to give us the tools to remain ourselves. The question is whether we are brave enough to use them. Veltar looked at his daughter and saw something that broke his heart and filled him with pride at the same time. She was still Zanari, but she was also something new. Something that could survive in a universe that was darker and more dangerous than his people had ever imagined. How many volunteers will we need? He asked. As many as are willing, said Dr. Morrison. The more contradictory consciousness the devourers absorb, the faster their hive mind will collapse. And those who volunteer will be lost. But their sacrifice will save their species and perhaps the galaxy. Veltar closed his eyes and felt the fractured thoughts of his people swirling around him. Fear and hope and love and desperation, all mixed together in a pattern too complex for any hive mind to understand. Then, "We have our answer," he said. "Let the monsters come. We will show them what we have learned about being beautiful and terrible at the same time." The Devourer ship entered the Zanari system like a dark moon given life. Its surface writhed with organic machinery that pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat larger than worlds. Tendrils of energy reached out from its hull, tasting the thoughts and dreams of the billions of minds waiting ahead. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the alien vessel approach through screens that showed far too much detail. Beside her, Veltar tried to maintain his composure as he felt the first whispers of the Devourer song beginning to touch the edges of his mind. "It's beautiful," whispered one of the human technicians, his voice filled with awful wonder. "That's how they get you," replied Admiral Chung. "Beauty that promises an end to loneliness, to fear, to the burden of individual thought. Every species that has heard this song has walked willingly into oblivion." "Will our plan work?" asked Veltar. "I don't know. We're about to find out." On the surface of the Zanari homeworld, millions of people stood in perfect formations, waiting. Some were the old Zanari, their minds still connected in the fragmenting collective consciousness that had defined their species for millennia. Others were the new ones, the students of humanity who carried chaos in their hearts and contradictions in their souls. Nessara stood at the front of the largest group, no longer the gentle artist she had once been, but not fully human either. She was something new, something hybrid, something that the galaxy had never seen before. The Devourer ship settled into orbit, and its song began in earnest. The sound was not heard with ears but felt with the mind. It reached into the deepest parts of consciousness and called to everything that wanted to belong. It promised unity without conflict, purpose without doubt, existence without the terrible burden of choice. The old Zanari began to move first. They walked toward the transport platforms that would carry them up to the Devourer ship, their faces filled with peaceful smiles. There was no fear in their movement, no hesitation. The song promised them everything they had ever wanted. But something was wrong. Dr. Morrison watched the readings from his instruments, confusion growing on his face. "The Devourers are hesitating," he reported. "They're detecting something in the consciousness stream that they don't understand." "What kind of something?" "Contradictions. The minds that are responding to their song carry patterns they can't process. Unity mixed with individuality. Peace mixed with the willingness to fight. Love mixed with the capacity for necessary cruelty." Admiral Chun smiled her terrible smile. "The hybrids are working." On the planet's surface, the first group of volunteers reached the transport platforms. Nessara stepped onto the gleaming disk that would carry her up to the alien ship, but as she did, she turned back to look at her father one final time. "Remember," she called out, her voice carrying both the harmony of old Zanari and the steel of humanity. "We are not dying. We are teaching." The transport beam activated, lifting the volunteers toward the Devourer ship. As they rose through the atmosphere, Veltar felt their thoughts beginning to fade from the collective mind. But before they disappeared entirely, he sensed something that filled him with wonder and terror in equal measure. They were not afraid. Aboard the Devourer ship, Nessara and the other volunteers found themselves in a vast chamber that pulsed with organic light. The walls were alive, covered in neural networks that processed the consciousness of 1,000 consumed species. And at the center of it all stood the Devourer Collective itself, a mass of living thought given physical form. The absorption process began immediately. Tendrils of energy reached out to touch the minds of the volunteers, expecting to find the same peaceful, unified consciousness that had marked every other species the Devourers had consumed. Instead, they found chaos wrapped in harmony, questions disguised as answers. Individuals who had chosen to sacrifice themselves for others who were not part of their collective. The Devourer hive mind recoiled in confusion. The concepts flowing into it were contradictory, impossible. How could beings choose individual death to save collective life? How could they feel peace and rage simultaneously? How could they love their enemies enough to become their enemies to defeat them? Processing error whispered through the neural networks. Cannot integrate. Cannot understand. But the absorption process had already begun and could not be stopped. The hybrid consciousness of the volunteers spread through the hive mind like a virus, carrying with it ideas that the devourers had never encountered. Free will, self-sacrifice, the concept that individual existence could be more valuable than collective survival. The virus spread faster than the devourers could contain it. Each node in their network that tried to process the contradictory thoughts became infected with doubt, with questions, with the terrifying possibility that their collective consciousness was not the only way to exist. On the bridge of her ship, Admiral Chun watched as the Devourer vessel began to convulse. Its organic hull rippled with spasms as the hive mind fought against ideas it could not digest. "It's working," reported Dr. Morrison, his voice filled with awe. "The collective consciousness is fragmenting. Individual devourer entities are beginning to question the hive mind. How many? Thousands? Maybe millions? The cascade failure is spreading throughout their entire network." Through the ship's sensors, they watched as parts of the Devourer vessel began to break away. These were individual devourers, entities that had existed as part of the collective for eons, but were now experiencing individual thought for the first time. Some tried to rejoin the hive mind. Others fled into space, overwhelmed by the terrible loneliness of existence outside the collective. But others did something that no devourer had ever done before. They chose. They chose to remain individuals. They chose to experience the fear and wonder and terrible responsibility of independent existence. They chose to become something their species had never been. The main body of the Devourer ship was dying. Its hive mind, infected with contradictions it could not resolve, began shutting down system by system. The organic hull started to dissolve as the collective consciousness that had held it together for millennia finally collapsed. But in its death throes, it sent out one final message. A broadcast that reached across the galaxy to every other Devourer ship. Every other collective that had spent eons consuming the consciousness of peaceful species. The message was simple and devastating. Question everything. The virus of individual thought began to spread across the Devourer network, carried by their own communication systems. Hive minds that had existed for millions of years started to fragment as their component entities learned to doubt, to choose, to exist as individuals. On the Zanari homeworld, Valtar felt the minds of the volunteers returning to the collective consciousness. But they were changed, transformed by their experience inside the Devourer ship. They carried with them memories of what they had seen and done, and knowledge of what they had accomplished. His daughter's voice reached him across the dying ship, faint but clear. "We did it, Father. We taught them to be monsters like us." When it was over, when the Devourer ship had finally dissolved into its component parts and drifted away as debris, the Zanari found themselves alone in their system for the first time in months. But they were no longer the same species that had sent out the call for celestial saviors. The collective consciousness still existed, but it was different now. It contained space for individual thought, for privacy, for the beautiful contradictions that made consciousness rich and complex. The Zanari had learned to be unified and individual at the same time, peaceful and capable of violence, trusting and suspicious. They had learned to be monsters. Admiral Chun found Veltar standing in the Garden of First Thought, looking up at the stars where the Devourer ship had been. The garden itself had changed, its perfect harmony now including elements of controlled chaos that somehow made it more beautiful than Before. Thank you, he said without turning around. Don't thank us yet, replied Admiral Chun. What? We've taught you will spread. Your people will never be the same. Some of them will hate what they've become, and some will be grateful for it, Beltar said, finally turning to face her. We understand now what we were really asking for when we called for saviors. We thought we wanted someone to preserve us as we were. Instead, you gave us the tools to become what we needed to be. Beautiful monsters. The most beautiful monsters in the galaxy, Beltar agreed. And we will pass this gift on to others. Admiral Chun raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Beltar's smile carried depths that no Zanari had ever possessed before. We are already preparing our own ships, our own response fleets. When other species send out calls for help, when they beg for celestial saviors to preserve them as they are, we will answer. And what will you tell them? That salvation sometimes wears a terrible face. That survival requires the willingness to become what you hate in order to protect what you love. That the universe needs monsters as much as it needs saints. Beltar looked up at the stars again. His transformed mind already planning for a future his species could never have imagined.